All right, so welcome back to Bookkast, where we bring you the bestsellers in minutes. I'm Paul, and I'm Sarah. And today we're diving deep into chaos. Chaos! Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s by Tom O'Neill and Dan Piepenbring. And you're probably here listening because you're interested in the Manson case, but you're also interested in how stories and narratives around major events get made and how they can be challenged even decades later. You're looking for the surprising facts, the insights that might actually shift your understanding of this story without getting bogged down in a ton of detail. And that's what we're hoping to do today. And this book, Chaos, really is sort of positioning itself as a direct challenge to the long-accepted narrative of the Manson murders, and particularly Vincent Bugliosi's huge bestseller, Helter Skelter. This isn't just a straightforward account of the Manson family murders. It's really a 2-decade-long investigation that questions almost everything we thought we knew about this case. And one of the things that immediately grabbed me was O'Neill's recounting of his interactions with Bugliosi.
And the defensiveness, even all these years later from the prosecutor, just feels really significant. Bugliosi even threatened a massive libel lawsuit against O'Neill for even looking into this further. And it just makes you wonder what sensitive areas O'Neill was uncovering. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it definitely raises a bunch of red flags, right? It suggests that the narrative is more fragile than we think. And I think that O'Neill, from the start, is very clear that his goal wasn't to excuse Manson in any way. He straight up calls him evil in the book. But his goal was just to really find out, what actually happened. And I thought it was so interesting that Stephen Kay, who was Bugliosi's co-prosecutor, he worked on this case with him, actually felt that there were notes in Bugliosi's handwriting that could overturn the Manson family's verdicts. So that's a pretty powerful statement coming from someone who was literally right there in the courtroom.
Yeah, it really highlights that there are some potential cracks in the official story. And that's what you were kind of hoping to find out more about right when you suggested we look at this book. I was so intrigued by that.
Yeah, and another thing that O'Neill talks about is his own experience reading Helter Skelter before starting his investigation. And even though it's this super infamous case, he found it completely absorbing, all these disturbing details he'd never heard before. And it kind of transformed the story from something that was just familiar to something that was super intriguing. And it really makes it clear why he felt so compelled to spend so much time and energy digging deeper. So you can see the origin story of the book. Chaos starts with Helter Skelter.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so let's get into some specifics of the book. Let's start with the lead up to the Tate murders at 1050 Cielo Drive. The book just briefly touches on Patricia Krenwinkel's early life, talking about a hormone issue that led to overeating and feelings of being unwanted. And that seems to have contributed to drug use and her disappearance in 1967. It paints this picture of someone who was vulnerable before she encountered Manson.
Yeah, that's a crucial piece of context, right? A lot of the members of the family came from really difficult and often traumatic backgrounds.
And you start to think about how someone like Manson could prey on that vulnerability. The book then goes on to describe the scene at Cielo Drive, noting that Roman Polanski was actually absent that night because he was in London. And they emphasize how secluded the house was, almost invisible from the street, which adds another layer of unease, I think, to the whole story.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, the book goes on to recount the horrific details of Sharon Tate's murder by Susan Atkins and Tex Watson. It's just awful to read about Tate's desperate pleas for her life and for her unborn child. Atkins' response is so cold, and the brutality of the multiple stab wounds is just devastating. It's just this awful reminder of the human cost of this whole thing.
It is, and the book then pivots to look at the broader societal impact of the crimes. And it's really striking to me how these murders just shattered the image of the hippie movement. Suddenly this counterculture, which had been viewed by some as, relatively harmless expression of youthful idealism, was now associated with unimaginable violence in the public mind. And that really dramatically shifted the narrative about the hippies, didn't it?
Yeah.
And it fueled existing anxieties about, youth culture and drug use, and the sense that traditional order was being undermined. There's an estimate in the book that 33 people might have been killed simply because Manson ordered it.
Which gives you a sense of the scale of the violence potentially linked back to him.
Absolutely. So to understand how Manson could have exerted so much control, the book looks back at his extensive history within the federal reformatory system. His long record of antisocial behavior and the psychic trauma that he endured. Instances of rape and escapes going all the way back to his teenage years. It's just this picture of a deeply disturbed individual long before 1969. It makes you wonder how someone with that history could have been able to operate so freely.
Yeah, absolutely. And O'Neill talks about watching early television footage of Manson, and he was surprised because he doesn't see this charismatic figure that we often hear about. He sees an unsocialized air and a kind of jailhouse aggression, which maybe got misinterpreted as authenticity.
The book also mentions Manson's behavior during the pretrial hearings, demanding to represent himself, and his followers mimicking his defiance, all really showing like the level of control he maintained even within the legal system.
Right.
And then we get to this infamous Helter Skelter motive, the whole idea of racial tension and apocalyptic prophecies and messages in rock music. And the book really stresses that this was a totally novel theory that was introduced in the courtroom. Paul Watkins' testimony about an underground city awaiting the family after a race war. It almost sounds unbelievable.
But I know, and it was drawn from the Book of Revelation, trying to find these hidden messages. And then you have the convicted women's testimony, where they completely absolve Manson. And they express no remorse. Their explanation that, killing was actually an act of love, that freed the victim from their physical being. It's so chilling. Susan Atkins' clinical recollection of stabbing Sharon Tate is just harrowing to read. It really shows how effective his manipulation was and how deeply he warped their sense of reality and morality.
The book actually delves into accounts from former family members about Manson's brainwashing techniques. It started with overwhelming displays of affection, sex, and drugs. The book describes these near-weekly orgies at the Spawn Ranch that Manson orchestrated. It's unsettling. Bugliosi even describes Manson arranging bodies, like a sculptor. It's really disturbing. And then, during the death penalty phase, the defense actually argued that Manson had brainwashed his followers. They brought in psychiatric experts who discussed how LSD could reshape someone's personality, and how the guy during an acid trip could implant violent ideas. It just raises all these questions about free will and manipulation. Absolutely. And the book also looks at some of the contradictions surrounding the atmosphere at Cielo Drive before the murders. The media was so quick to blame Hollywood's decadence, that kind of lie, freaky, die, freaky attitude. They argue that it created this environment where violence was inevitable. But then O'Neill really starts to pick apart the Helter Skelter motive. He questioned the idea that Manson targeted the Cielo house to scare Terry Melcher,
The record producer who turned him down.
Because the family never actually communicated this motive to Melcher. It just seems like this fundamental flaw in the narrative, doesn't it? How do you instill fear in someone if they don't know it's directed at them?
Exactly. And this leads O'Neill to really start exploring other possibilities. He talks about how hard it was for him to actually get Hollywood figures to talk about the aftermath of the murders. People like Bruce Dern and Kirk Douglas declined to be interviewed. It seems like there's a lingering discomfort around the whole topic, or even decades later.
Right.
And the book touches on some of those more sensational rumors surrounding Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate's relationship, allegations of film sexual encounters and orgies. It brings in perspective from people like Dominic Dunn and James Toback. It just adds this whole other layer of intrigue to the story. And friends of Sharon Tate even mentioned that she was uncomfortable with some of Polanski's friends, particularly Frykowski and Folger. It suggests some tension within that group, or it paints a more complex picture of the social circle.
Yeah, and then it goes deeper into the relationship between Tate and Polanski. And even Tate's own thoughts about leaving him. Someone even says that Tate wound up getting murdered because he's fooling around in London. It's harsh, but it hints at other issues, potentially issues that go beyond Manson.
Yeah, it kind of shifts the focus a little bit away from Manson being the sole driving force. It introduces the idea that there might have been more immediate and personal conflicts involved. Yeah, absolutely. And then the book starts looking at Frykowski's connections to a much more dangerous crowd, bringing in figures like Pickett Dawson, who was involved in drug smuggling and had even threatened Frykowski. Yeah, and then we get to Billy Doyle and Charles Taco with their alleged ties to drug dealing and intelligence agencies. There's even a story about Frykowski and Sebring retaliating against Doyle at a party. It's really unsettling. Yeah, Taco is like this super enigmatic figure. Rumors of CIA connections, knife throwing, drug smuggling. It just goes on and on. It's really hard to confirm any of it. But then you have Corinne Calvett's alarming stories involving Taco.
It adds to this feeling that there are these hidden, dangerous forces at play.
Yeah, and Billy Doyle's shifting accounts. And his belief that Polanski and Frykowski were Polish spies. It's really strange. And his alibi for the night of the murders, that he and Taco were filming a pot movie in Jamaica, which he later admitted was a cover for intelligence work. It just raises so much suspicion. It really points to a deeper level of intrigue than we would have thought.
Yeah, and Doyle just became convinced that there was more to the murders than the official story. He even thought that O'Neill was Polanski's private investigator. It really shows you the paranoia and distrust that was going on. You mentioned O'Neill's focus on Doyle and Taco as potential sources of motive. instead of the Helter Skelter theory. And it really starts to become this key part of his challenge to the established narrative.
Yeah, and we also can't forget about the presence of mob figures and criminals around Jay Sebring's shop. There's this character called Baron, who had alleged mob ties and security intelligence clearance. And there are these unsettling allegations that Baron and his associates did terrible things to black people.
And Charlie being the worst of them. So it really broadens the scope of potential actors and motives, right?
Yeah, it does. And then the book kind of circles back to Terry Melcher as like the most direct link between Manson and Hollywood, focusing on his initial promise of a record deal and his subsequent backing out. And so then we revisit that official explanation of Manson targeting Melcher's former house to instill fear, which, we've already discussed. O'Neill just doesn't find that explanation very convincing.
Yeah, that's a big part of his argument, right? And Melcher's testimony, that he only met Manson 3 times before the murders. It was really interesting. O'Neill introduces this idea of the golden penetrators, Wilson Jacobson and Melcher. And he questions why they remained so silent after the murders. Even though they probably suspected Manson, it suggests that they didn't want to cooperate with the investigation, or maybe they were afraid of what they might reveal, And then there's Rudy Altobelli, who owned the Cielo Drive house. The book mentions that he was immediately suspicious of Manson after the murders, and his lawyer advised him to stay quiet. He ends up staying with Melcher and Candice Bergen after the murders. And Jacobson makes this cryptic remark about the musician that Manson was supposed to have killed. It just hints this deeper unspoken understanding within this Hollywood circle. That was never really explored. It just seems like there's more to it than meets the eye.
Yeah. And then there's Melcher's strong attachment to the Cielo Drive house, and his and Bergen's sudden departure, blaming their housekeeper. It's just suspicious. They clearly wanted to distance themselves from the location and any potential connections to the murders. And this defense attorney, Bill Nelson, managed to get police files from a polygraph examiner in the Tate investigation named Earl Deemer, and later from a retired homicide detective, Mike McGann. And those files gave O'Neill this crucial source of information outside the official channels. That really helped him build his argument. Yeah, and then you get this bombshell from Stephen Kay, that Manson and Watson actually attended a party at the Cielo house when Melcher and Bergen lived there. That gives you another more direct reason for why Manson might have targeted that specific location.
And it contradicts Melcher's sworn testimony that he never saw Watson at his house. It's a significant inconsistency that O'Neill brings to light, right? It totally undermines Melcher's credibility. And that whole idea that the motive was just to instill fear in Melcher because of the record deal.
Yeah.
And then O'Neill talks about this unsettling encounter with Manson's former attorney, Irving Kanarek, who made some very serious accusations against Bugliosi, like claiming he was an indicted perjurer, and making some claims about his personal conduct, which were unsubstantiated. And, you kind of have to take Kanarek's statements with a grain of salt. But O'Neill later confirms that Bugliosi was indicted for perjury because of the leak of Manson's alleged celebrity hit list during the trial, which is really something. I mean, it paints a picture of a much less straightforward legal process.
Yeah.
And then we have Melcher's conflicting testimony about when he last saw Manson. Evidence suggests that he saw him after May 1969, despite what he said under oath. And Bugliosi never even questioned Danny DiCarlo about Melcher, even though DiCarlo was present at Bond Ranch.
It seems like a pretty big oversight in the investigation. Yep. And Gary Stromberg, who worked with Terry Melcher, he confirms that everyone in their circle suspected Manson immediately after the murders, because Melcher fired him and stopped his recordings, and because they knew that the family had already murdered Shorty Shea. The Beach Boys were even ostracized because of their association with Manson, so it really underscores that immediate suspicion within the Hollywood community. Right, and the LASO archives had even more evidence. Paul Watkins also reports seeing Melcher at the Spawn Ranch around the same time as Danny DiCarlo in early September 1969, after the murders. So again, this presence of Melcher at the ranch after the murders directly contradicts his testimony. And it raises these questions about what he knew and when he knew it. Yeah, it really complicates the official narrative. Definitely. And then O'Neill describes his eventual meeting with Terry Melcher in 2000, noting his appearance and demeanor. And Melcher offers O'Neill the chance to co-author his memoirs, which really feels like a transparent attempt to control the narrative, doesn't it?
It does. And then Greg Jacobson's inconsistent statements, especially about whether Manson knew Melcher had moved, and the green spyglass incident. It just highlights the unreliability of some of these key witnesses.
Right.
And then the 30th anniversary of the murders passes, and O'Neill's story still hasn't been published, even though the editor at Premiere was initially enthusiastic. And that kind of suggests how difficult it is to challenge such a deeply entrenched narrative. So this really leads O'Neill to focus more intently on potential discrepancies and cover-ups within LSO, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office. Right. And a defense attorney named Paul Fitzgerald becomes a key contact, giving O'Neill the number for Charlie Gunther, who Fitzgerald describes as an honest cop. And Gunther and his partner Whiteley become these important sources for O'Neill, revealing what they perceived as a series of missteps and potential cover-ups within LSO. Right, and the book also talks about this tape recording of Bobby Beausoleil's phone call from jail, where he implicates others in the Hinman murder. But LSO seems to have ignored this call.
Another prosecutor, Aaron Stovitz, even believed that the Tate LaBianca murders were copycat crimes. But he felt that Bugliosi's narrative just controlled everything. So again, it's pointing to these alternative interpretations that were never really considered.
Yeah. And then you have Preston Guillory, who was an LASO deputy involved in the Spahn Ranch raid. His conduct was really questionable, and LASO tried to discredit him after he spoke out. And Guillory believed that LASO knew early on that the family committed the murders, and that the raid gave them enough evidence to violate Manson's parole. But they didn't do anything about it. O'Neill got access to LASO reports on activities at the Spahn Ranch, and those reports reveal a significant amount of surveillance and intelligence gathering that was going on. And it really raises the question of why wasn't Manson apprehended sooner? They even got a warrant for his arrest on suspicion of stolen vehicles and other charges just before the Tate LaBianca murders. It just seems like they had enough to arrest him, but they didn't.
I know, and the deputies who arrested Manson after the Spahn Ranch raid were surprised that he wasn't charged.
They felt they had ample grounds for parole revocation based on all these charges against him from the first half of 1969. It seems like there's a deliberate decision not to keep him incarcerated. And then there's Gleason, who organized that Spahn Ranch raid. He failed to connect Kitty Lutzinger, who was a suspect in the Hinman murder and Beausoleil's girlfriend, to the people who were arrested at the ranch, even though she was right there in custody. Seems like a big oversight.
Yeah, it does. And then later, LASO was reluctant to share information with O'Neill, saying there's stuff you can never be told. It just reinforces that sense that they're hiding something. It really does. And then there were the conflicting accounts of Shiro Katami. He was a witness at the Cielo Drive guest house. And there are these allegations that his testimony was coerced by Reeve Whitson, who worked with the DA's office. Bugliosi denied even knowing Whitson, but other sources contradicted that. So it really raises serious questions about the integrity of the prosecution's case.
Yes, it does. And Reeve Whitson becomes this really central figure to O'Neill's investigation, with these alleged CIA ties and his cryptic behavior, his connections to Sebring and Polanski, and even the Beach Boys, through whom he supposedly met Manson before the murders. It just paints this picture of a much larger and more complex web of connections than we initially imagined. Whitson's ex-wife even talks about his CIA work and his habit of trying to avoid detection. It's like he was living this double life. The book even suggests that Whitson might have just been a con artist. But if he was a real intelligence operative, it raises all these disturbing questions about his potential knowledge of the murders.
Yeah, it does. And the book kind of expands this out even further to talk about CIA programs like COINTELPRO and Chaos, highlighting the FBI's efforts to disrupt left-wing groups and the CIA's domestic intelligence gathering during that era. And this provides this broader context of government surveillance and manipulation. That could connect to the Manson story. A lot of people kind of downplayed Manson's race war motive. And it's interesting how it aligned with the goals of certain federal agencies at that time. That's a really good point.
And then we can't forget about the withholding of evidence related to the Manson family, from prosecutor Bill Ross by his superiors and the detectives Gunther and Whiteley in the Hinman murder case. Ross immediately saw the connection between the Hinman murder and the Tate LaBianca killings, but he was deliberately kept in the dark. It's really strange. It is. And then the dismissal of Danny DiCarlo as an unreliable witness by Ross during the Hinman trial, that highlights these internal conflicts and these differing opinions within the DA's office regarding key witnesses. So it really complicates this idea of a unified and straightforward prosecution.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you have the unusual circumstances surrounding Susan Atkins' legal representation, the dismissal of her initial attorney, Ronald Hughes, and then the assignment of Richard Caballero. It raises questions about potential manipulation of the legal process. And then there's this unusual arrangement that allowed Atkins to be interviewed by her lawyers in Beverly Hills before the grand jury. And her story about Sharon Tate's murder changes. It just suggests that her testimony might have been orchestrated.
And Atkins' story was then published by Lawrence Schiller, potentially with help from the DA's office, just before a gag order was issued. So it's like this coordinated effort to control the public narrative. It does feel that way. And O'Neill even mentions this secretive special investigation section within the LAPD, known as the Death Squad, and allegations of their controversial policies. It just adds this other layer of potential misconduct and unaccountability.
Right. And then there's this really explosive claim from a former LAPD detective named Bowser that the Tate crime scene was presented incorrectly or possibly even staged. So that directly challenges the entire foundation of the official narrative. It's pretty shocking. And then, there's this continued suppression of files by various agencies related to the case. It underscores this ongoing lack of transparency. It just makes you think that there's still information out there that might contradict the accepted story. And then Premiere fires their editor, Jim Meeks, who supported O'Neill's investigation. So you see those powerful forces at play trying to suppress alternative accounts.
Yeah.
And then the book looks at the unusual clemency that was shown to Susan Atkins and Mary Brunner in earlier cases despite their criminal behavior. That clemency often came about because of Roger Smith, Manson's parole officer, who failed to disclose his close relationship with Manson. It just changes how you view those early stages of Manson's influence. And Smith's background in criminology research is really interesting, specifically research on amphetamines and violence in Haight-Ashbury hippies. That was actually funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, which had ties to the CIA. And Manson's time in Haight-Ashbury becomes this really critical period in his development as a cult leader. And Roger Smith's lack of proper parole supervision really seems to have played a role in that. So you have the San Francisco project that Smith supervised Manson on, and the amphetamine research project that Smith led. And they ran concurrently. During a time when Manson wasn't really getting much parole oversight, it raises all these questions about Smith's competence. Whether he was enabling Manson's behavior, absolutely. And then you have David Smith's research on the speed scene and its parallels to animal behavior. And he actually co-authored a study of the family with a former Manson follower. So it offers this really disturbing academic perspective on the dynamics of the group. But his views were often in conflict with Roger Smith's. Right, so interesting how Roger Smith downplayed any parallels between his research and Manson's behavior. But David Smith saw clear connections to his work on overcrowded environments and social breakdown.
Yeah, and the fact that Roger Smith never really intervened in Manson's behavior, or reported his drug use or manipulation of others, that's a huge dereliction of duty for a parole officer.
It is. And then David Smith and Al Rose published this study of the Manson family shortly after the murders. And Smith really downplays Rose's direct involvement as a follower. So it highlights the potential biases that were going on and those early attempts to really understand the family. And then, Roger Smith finally agrees to speak with O'Neill. After years of silence, he doesn't seem to feel any guilt about it at all. It's kind of chilling.
It is.
And then the book explores the involvement of Louis J. West, a psychiatrist with alleged CIA ties, and documented involvement in MKULTRA experiments. He was involved in the Haight-Ashbury scene during the same time Manson was there. The description of West's lab disguised as a hippie crash pad is really unsettling. It is. And West had all these research interests, including the Manson murders. And he had documented connections to the CIA and MKULTRA, to people like Sidney Gottlieb. It raises these questions about the links between mind control experiments and the counterculture. Absolutely. And West did these experiments with LSD and truth serums. He even evaluated Jack Ruby. So it really underscores his involvement in this controversial research. And you wonder about his potential influence on people like Manson and on the counterculture scene in general, right? And O'Neill tries to share his findings with Senator Arlen Specter, who investigated MKULTRA. And O'Neill starts to get really paranoid about his access to West's files. It's like he stumbled onto something really sensitive and potentially dangerous. And then O'Neill kind of reflects on the complexity of everything he's found.
He acknowledges that there's not really a single smoking gun, but there's this overwhelming amount of evidence that contradicts the official narrative. And it's hard to believe that all of these different law enforcement agencies would have cooperated so perfectly to solve this case, as the official story suggests. I mean, it does seem highly unlikely. And the book talks about Vincent Bugliosi's history of using aggressive tactics. He sued the Weissels for slander and defamation, which he eventually settled. But it shows how litigious he was and how determined he was to control the narrative. And Bugliosi initially refused to be interviewed by O'Neill again. He cited unnamed sources and made accusations against O'Neill. He just didn't want to engage with these alternative perspectives.
Yeah, and when O'Neill finally does get to interview Bugliosi, it's a contentious interview. Bugliosi even threatens to sue him. And he deflects key questions, particularly about Terry Melcher's post-murder visits to the Spawn Ranch. It's like he knew how significant that information was, but he tried to dismiss it. There was this back and forth between Bugliosi and O'Neill's publisher, Penguin.
And O'Neill actually prepared to defend himself against a lawsuit. So it just shows how high the stakes were.
Right.
And then O'Neill starts looking into the deaths of Joel Pugh in London and John Philip Tenerelli in Bishop, both of which were initially ruled suicides. But there are all these suspicious circumstances and overlooked evidence that suggests potential connections to the family. It makes you wonder about the full scope of the family's activities and whether all of the relevant information came to light in the original investigations. And in the end, O'Neill doesn't claim to have found the absolute truth, but he does aim to prove that the official story is flawed. He emphasizes that lack of transparency from official agencies, and you see that continued secrecy in the ongoing legal battles over Tex Watson's recorded interviews, which are still being kept from the public and even from the victims' families. O'Neill even has this brief phone conversation with Manson in 2000. It highlights that this case remains a mystery, even all these years later. And you can really see the depth of O'Neill's investigation, just in the extensive list of sources at the end of the book.
So as you can see from this deep dive into chaos, there are so many layers and unanswered questions surrounding the Manson family story. It really makes you think about the complexity of historical narratives and the potential for hidden truths. O'Neill's research really challenges that long-accepted version of events. And I think for you, the listener, it highlights the importance of looking beyond the surface and considering alternative perspectives. Even when a case seems as well documented as this one, it really makes you think about how we understand events and how those events get shaped into history. Definitely. So that's your Bookkast for today, Bestsellers in Minutes. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into chaos and that it sparked your curiosity to explore these findings and to think about all the questions that are raised about this really fascinating case. Until next time, keep turning those pages.